Western skepticism meets Eastern theology and gets crushed. I'm your host for today, Josh Wolf, and today we are discussing the problem of evil and reincarnation. And let me just make sure that we are actually broadcasting live so that the internet is, yeah, there we go. We're definitely live. Welcome. Thanks for tuning in. We have two great guests today, very highly educated and accomplished scholars who are going to be discussing the problem of evil, a perennial topic of philosophical debate among theologians and skeptics. It challenges the faith of many and is a strong reason for many skeptics to remain skeptical, and even for the faithful believers in theism, holders to theological traditions. It is a cause of debate, consternation, discussion. Why does evil exist? And what are the implications of that for the nature of God or the nature of reality, the nature of our faith? So today's discussion really is aimed at those who start from the position that there is some kind of God who exists, and then how do we deal with the fact that evil exists in the world? So our two guests today are going to discuss this from a Christian tradition and also from a Gaudiya Vaishnava, or the Hare Krishna Eastern tradition. My two guests today are Seth Hart and Akshay Gupta, Ādi Puruṣa Dāsa. So I'm going to bring them on and introduce them and then give them the floor. So first we have on the left, in the red corner, Seth Hart. He's a PhD student in theology at the University of Durham, which is in England, under the Durham Doctoral Studentship. And he has 3 graduate degrees already in theology, one from the University of Oxford, one from Regent College, and one from Johnson University. Seth's research focuses on the intersection of biology and Christian theology, and he currently resides in Little Rock, Arkansas with his wife and corgi. Welcome, Seth.
It's good to be here.
Thank you for tuning in and for making yourself available for this discussion.
I really enjoy it.
And then in the blue corner, we have Akshay Gupta, aka Ādi Puruṣa Dāsa. He's a PhD candidate at Cambridge University. This is a Cambridge versus Oxford smackdown right here.
You bet.
He holds a master's degree in religious studies from Duke University, and Duke University in Durham, North Carolina.
So Durham versus Durham.
Durham versus Durham.
Durham versus Durham, Oxford versus Cambridge, Christianity versus Hare Krishna. We got it all going on here today. So Ādi Puruṣa has a undergraduate degree in religious studies from UNC-Chapel Hill, and his research interests include Hindu Theology, philosophical theology, Caitanya Vaiṣṇavism, and the problem of evil. Sorry, the problem of evil. His PhD dissertation explores how the Caitanya Vaishnava tradition's theological framework addresses the problem of evil. So this is going to be a great discussion today. Thank you for tuning in, Ādi Puruṣa Dāsa.
Thank you for having me.
So the format of today's discussion, we're going to begin with opening statements, and then it's going to be a kind of a free-form discussion between Seth and Ādi Puruṣa. And for our viewers out there, you're welcome to ask your questions, make your comments in the YouTube comments chat, and we'll draw those in as well. Today's discussion is going to go for about 2 hours. It's 10:05 a.m. here in Auckland, New Zealand. And so we'll be going until 12 p.m. New Zealand time, which is whatever time it is wherever you are in the world. So we're going to begin now with giving the floor, the microphone to Seth to begin with his opening statements about the problem of evil and the solution that the Christian kind of perspective brings to that problem. So I'll hand the floor over to you now, Seth.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, so Ādi and I have talked a little bit about this before, and we realized that there were a lot of topics with the problem of evil that really needed to be addressed. So just in sort of private conversation, we decided this debate, we wanted to center more on the soteriological, the salvation issues that sort of separate the Hare Krishna tradition from the Christian tradition. The reincarnation system for dealing with evil, especially internal evil, the virtues of evil, and why people actually experience evil. One says reincarnation as a solution. The other one is a single life. That's a Christian perspective, saying you have a single life, and at the end of that, you're judged based upon that. And you either go heaven, hell, or depending on your tradition, a purgatorial intermediate state. So focusing on those issues, I just wanted to, instead of attacking sort of straw men and trying to defend a Christian single life perspective, I'll wait until he says a few things and then I'll reply. Instead, I just want to offer a few objections that I have to the reincarnation system. Now, the biggest ones that I want to focus on are moral. There's also rational and evidential issues. We can get into that really, but I really want to focus in on what I consider to be the moral issues with the reincarnation system. And I think the biggest problems that I find in the reincarnation system is that it seems to marginalize or diminish our view of freedom, grace, and justice. Now, I'll take these in order. When it comes to freedom, I believe, and it's something, it's an objection I raised in the first debate that we had. I just got a message. It doesn't sound like my sound's very good. Am I good? Can you guys hear me well? I just got a message from Margina. Can you guys hear me well?
You know, where I am, listening to it through the Restream studio sounds great.
Okay.
There's not really anything I can do
just
with the sound here. I'll tune into the YouTube channel and listen to it there and give you some feedback.
Okay. All right. I'm going to keep going while you do that. All right.
Yeah, go.
So the first thing is freedom, getting back to that, the idea of freedom. Now, both Ādi and I agree that freedom is a solution, a major solution to the problem of evil. But the biggest difference, I believe, is that in a reincarnation system, it seems to actually diminish freedom, the value of freedom. The analogy I gave is, imagine a mouse maze. Now, you put the mouse in, it has many different choices on the path it goes. But if every single path ends up in the same place, the mouse's choices ultimately are determined. They don't really matter that much. In the same way, in the reincarnation system, it doesn't matter what choices you make in the here and now, because ultimately it will be solved eschatologically. It will be solved at the end. You're finally going to make it we're all going to make it into the same place. Now that seems to marginalize our freedom of choice. It doesn't seem to matter that much. But on the Christian system, your free choice does matter. If you only have one life, if God has given you one life to make the most of your free choice, that seems to maximize our choice here and now. And I believe that's what you need if we're going to solve the problem of evil. If we're to prefer a world of evil and free will over, say, a deterministic system, say a deterministic system where no one ever sins, nothing bad ever happens, but people don't have free will, God sort of controls everything, we have to say that our freedom is so valuable that it outweighs all the evils of the world. That's this classic free will defense. But if you marginalize our freedom here and now, even if they have some sort of finite value, ultimately, they're not going to outweigh the overall evils of rape, torture, murders, genocide that we find in the world. And I think only on the Christian system, where our free choices actually affect the universe from now till eternity, our free choices affect the universe from forever, can you give freedom that infinite value? Because it determines the universe forever. So I actually ground the value of freedom temporally. To get academic, I ground it temporally in the fact that freedom is ultimately valuable because it has ultimate value in the temporal sense. It affects the universe forever. In the reincarnation system, that is not true. No matter what choices you make, no matter what, at the end of the day, they don't really matter in any sort of ultimate sense. Now that's objection one. Objection two is to grace. I don't find there's any ultimate place for grace in the karmic system. It's all ultimately focused on justice, which is my third point, which I'll get to in a second. But grace and mercy are, mercy and justice are often juxtaposed to one another. Mercy is treating someone better than they deserve, whereas justice is treating someone as they deserve. Now, it seems to be a contradiction. You can't treat someone better than they deserve, be merciful to them, be gracious to them, and treat them as they deserve, not giving them any sort of special treatment. But we value both of these as moral goods. So how do you reconcile that an all-good being has to be both all-merciful and all-just? How does the reincarnation system deal with that? Well, I would say that it doesn't. What it ultimately says is you work out the difficulties within you, and God might help you in a very finite sense. but he doesn't deal with your sins. That's what you do. He doesn't pay the price for your sins. He's not infinitely gracious like he is in the Christian system, where it doesn't matter what sins you do, he will pay for them. That's the difference. And I find that to be a morally superior vision of grace of God, where God's not finitely gracious, where he's helping you to in a certain extent, but you have to contribute effort. He's God in the Christian system is infinitely gracious. No matter what, he always is offering an open arms to forgive them and do away. He has dealt with the penalty of that. So I think Christians have a higher view of grace, which is more compatible with an idea of an all-good God. And finally, there is, I said justice, that they focus on justice. I actually don't think they deal well with justice either. And the biggest problem is on a reincarnation system, there doesn't seem to be a reason why we don't remember our past lives. Like why whenever somebody restarts their life, if they're to learn a new lesson, it seems contradictory to have them forget all the things they've done. It seems that the better system would be to know exactly why they're being punished so that they can correct that action and get that quicker. It seems to only prolong our suffering, which is unjust. So wouldn't it be more just to know what you're suffering for? This amnesia that occurs between lives doesn't seem to have any purpose whatsoever, and only actually increases the amount of evil we do, since we can't link our current sufferings to the past evil actions that we're suffering for. And one last point on that is there seems to be an odd cruelty in this system. Now, if you were to look at, say, a child who's being abused by his parents, and you were to say, why is this happening? Why does God allow this? And you were to say, well, he did something terrible in his last life. He has no idea what he did. But that child is being abused by his parents. He actually deserves it. There's something cruel and inhumane and unjust about that. Even if true, it smacks against our inner system of what we think is just. So those are my three moral objections. And just real quickly, I'll throw out just a couple others. If Ādi wants to pick these up, I know we've got limited time, and I don't want to shotgun a million objections at him. But from an evidential basis is the other thing I thought. Outside moral reasons, there's an evidential reason, which is that all evidence seems to suggest that we only do have one life, so that people, when they come into the world, they're unique individuals. They're not tied to some past lives. So the burden of proof is just prima facie on the person who believes in reincarnation to justify that, because available evidence seems to suggest otherwise. And evidence for reincarnation, things like past life memories and stuff like that, I call those underdeterminative, because even though it's possible to say somebody who might have memories of a past life that they've never experienced, and you can confirm that, that doesn't prove they were that person. All that proves is that they might have the memories of that person. And there's people like Irvin Laszlo, Akashic Field Studies, Rupert Sheldrake, and other interpretations of that don't appeal to reincarnation. So even that, it doesn't in any way favor reincarnation over these other solutions. And finally, a rational sort of philosophical objection, which is, how do we maintain our identity? So if I die and I get reincarnated, I have no memory, I don't have the physical body. What about me is actually transmitted that makes me the same person that I was in a previous life? And the more you sort of have to wrestle with that, it gets to a point where you start cutting away. Like, it's not my memory, it's not my physical embodiment, it's not my personalities. You reduce the concept of a soul, that thing that gets carried on, down to nothing, to where it's an empty concept. So I find it's difficult to actually make sense of the reincarnation from a philosophical basis. I ran through those real quickly, and I'm just throwing those out there. Feel free to pick up on that, but that's my opening salvo.
Great. Thanks for that, Seth. Those three moral points, and then a bit of a shock and awe salvo at the end with some options for Ādi Puruṣa to pick them up. No, that's great. It gives Ādi Puruṣa a lot of options to work with, and also, great points. Great points.
Thanks.
So we'll now pass the mic over to Ādi Puruṣa for his opening statement.
Okay, cool. So, yeah, quite a lot of things there. This is fun. So my main thesis is that the Hare Krishna theology, through having reincarnation and soul-making mechanisms, sort of karmic mechanisms that allow you to learn soul-making lessons in each life, by the fact that Hare Krishna allows for the possibility of universal salvation. Because if you fail to attain salvation in one, you basically have an unlimited opportunity to get it in a future life. So I can put forth the following proposition. Hopefully this is sensible to a lay audience. Basically, a state of affairs, meaning like sort of some fact or something, some state, I guess, obtains if there's an infinite number of distinctive instances where that state of affairs has a non-zero possibility of obtaining. And what I mean by this is basically by reincarnation and soul-making mechanisms, the soul, it's basically sort of like assured that the soul will eventually attain salvation. If he doesn't get it in one life, he can get it in another. If he doesn't get it in that life, he can get another. He has unlimited opportunities to get salvation. But what's important is that the opportunities the soul gets are also distinctive from each other. So an analogy will be helpful to illustrate this point, actually. So let's say I offer you $5 if you shave your head. And you say, I don't really feel like shaving my head for $5. No, thanks. So I ask you the next day. And I say, hey, I'll give you $5 if you shave your head. And you're like, no, I still don't feel like doing it. I do it a third day. And then you're like, yeah, no, I still don't feel like shaving my head, man. And the fourth day happens. And then somehow on that day, you decide you really want like a candy bar from the store. And you want that candy bar so much that you'd do anything to get it, but you don't have any money. But if you had $5, you'd be able to get that candy bar. So now when I ask you, hey, you want $5? You're like, yeah, sure, I'll take you up on that offer. So even though you were presented with the same choice, because you had a distinct frame of consciousness on that fourth time, you accepted the offer. So reincarnation and soul making is like that. Because each life is distinct and we learn lessons throughout our different lives, we can ultimately learn to turn ourselves toward God. Whereas in a one life model, if you fail to turn to God once, then it's kind of like, well, that's it. So for that reason, I would argue that reincarnation, at least from a soteriological perspective, makes more sense than a one life model, because through reincarnation, everyone can ultimately come back to God. Now, I think I can maybe I'll respond to Seth's points now also. So one thing was the thing about the mouse cage. So if everyone ends up in the same place, then freedom choices are ultimately meaningless. I would disagree with this. Even though, is my connection breaking up for the audience? Is my connection good? Maybe someone can comment, let me know.
Yeah, it sometimes breaks up for us here in Restream Studio, but it prioritizes, the stream to YouTube. Okay, yeah. So Ram Gopal says, yeah, it did break up a little bit. So you might just want to reiterate that last point that you made.
Sorry, the point about how
distinct frames of consciousness allow the soul to make a different decision.
Oh, okay.
We got the analogy to the fourth day where you want to buy the candy bar, so you shave your hair for $5.
Yeah,
I'd take 10 on the third day.
Okay. So yeah, basically, in the same way that person took the candy bar on the fourth day, through that same process of having distinct states of consciousness throughout our different lives, we can eventually accept God's offer of salvation or turn towards God. Maybe that's more theologically precise, actually. So I can start fielding some of these objections. So one is the mouse case. If ultimately everyone ends up in the same place, it's like freedom is meaningless. I would disagree with that, because it's not like God. I think freedom basically entails you choosing an option when you could do otherwise. Maybe we could go this direction, but we could also get into a discussion of what it means for an action to be free. But I would say you're free with respect to an action if you have the opportunity to do the alternative. So you're free to turn towards God if you have the freedom to turn away from God. And this type of freedom doesn't necessitate that some people or a significant amount of people have to turn away from God. I think it just means that souls are free to continue to reject the ability to turn towards God as much as they want and as long as they want. But given infinite time, eventually they'll accept, and that's perfectly consistent with the idea of being able to freely choose your actions. So I don't think that's so much of a difficulty. The next point is interesting, the part about grace and justice. I would say in our theology, we have both. And actually, there's a tension between grace and justice. It's just like you can't have one without the other, and both seem like they would be good for an all-loving and omnipotent God, omnibenevolent God to have. Because if God is just, then there's no place for grace, and if God is graceful, there's no place for justice, it sounds like. And each one of those has their cons, actually. If God is gracious, then why not just allow everyone to attain salvation? Why choose some and others? Just let everyone attain salvation. That would be the maximal use of grace. And by that same token, actually, let me address that. So you would think that if God is maximally gracious, then he would basically allow everyone to attain salvation. So if you're going to push the grace card, then there's sort of an inconsistency because, well, not everyone's attaining salvation. So does that mean God is not maximally gracious? And the same thing kind of with justice. If God's not just, then and he's only gracious to some but not others, isn't that arbitrary? Shouldn't God not pick favorites? Shouldn't he be loving to everyone? So you sort of have this tension with grace and justice, and the way our theology resolves it is that so we have this saying, for every one step you take towards Krishna, Krishna takes 10 steps towards you. So the first step Krishna takes is justice. He's reciprocating to your desire to be with him. The next 9 steps are grace. And I think that resolves the tension between grace and justice well, because you have both at the same time. And I think it's very important to have some element of justice, because if God just graciously allows everyone to attain salvation, it's kind of overriding their free will. Like, God allows us to have our free will, and if God just sort of graciously intervenes on someone, even though that soul may not want that grace, then it's a violation of free will, and that's one of the main points, as we discussed last time. God did never override someone's free will. So I would say the model of God taking 10 steps for every one step you take is a perfect reconciliation of grace and justice. And then what was some of the other arguments? Okay, so the memory objection. It's a fair objection, but I would respond by saying that it's not necessary to know what you did wrong in order to learn a lesson. Oh, I know. I guess it's still, my connection's good. It hasn't. You're muted, Josh.
Yeah, so we got you starting to answer this point about memory, and
Okay.
the last thing I heard was that it's not necessary for you to remember what you did wrong in order to learn something from the lesson, and then it cut out.
Okay, good. Okay, so yeah, so if I punch someone in the last life and I get punched in this life, just because I don't remember punching someone doesn't mean that the experience of being punched won't teach me a lesson. Being punched in the face will basically teach me to be more sensitive, and that by doing that action to others, I cause them that amount of pain. So in the Vedic, or not the Vedic, the Hare Krishna view of the soul, chop, chop, chop. Maybe I'll go a little bit slower, just so everything gets picked up. Yeah, so the soul he's associated with a physical body, but he's also associated with what we call a subtle body, which is like his mind and some other, it's like a subtle, it's like his mind, intelligence, and sense of false egotism, as we say. And as we go through our lives, the different actions we do and the different experiences we have leave impressions on this subtle body. So by getting reactions to our karma, we sort of learn lessons, and these form impressions, and they help shape our behavior. So as we go throughout lives, we may not remember things, but just by experiencing certain things, we learn lessons and learn to be more sensitive and more attuned to God. And these impressions sort of mold our character so we can learn lessons. And what was the next objection? There's a thing about cruelty, I sort of forgot the details of that, but maybe we can revisit that. And then, yeah, as far as the evidence goes, I think it's hard to. I mean, I don't think seeing whether someone had a past life or not is really something we can investigate through empirical methods. There's sort of limitations to the empirical methods, and I think figuring out what someone was in their last life is one of those. I mean, yeah, people are unique, but that doesn't necessarily prove one life versus multiple lives. Actually, you could also argue that there's cases of identical twins and they have the same biological makeup, but they're also vastly different. So you would think that under a strictly sort of biological deterministic view, that the differences would be, under a biological deterministic one life kind of maybe view, you would think that they'd be quite similar if they're getting a fresh start and their sort of genetic makeup determines how they are. But the fact that there are identical twins that are very different from each other does sort of suggest that they came from different backgrounds, and that also sort of suggests a reincarnation model. But I think the evidence thing, I think it's hard to. I just don't think we have the really ability to see what someone was in their past life. So that's, I think, a little tough one to confirm or disconfirm. And as far as the identity concept, so I guess how the soul maintains identity is because its identity is rooted in the soul, but also when the soul reincarnates, it's associated with the subtle body, and that's sort of where these impressions are stored, and that's sort of what helps that's what carries our subconscious memories with us. So it's this subtle body that's responsible for us having some sort of, well, our soul and the subtle body goes from one life to another. So our physical bodies may change, but the subtle body and the soul sort of stay the same. So there's some way of explaining that. And I guess one final point is that let's say there's a happy medium between one life and reincarnation. Why not 2 lives? Why not 3 lives? Why not 4 lives? It seems like it would be a little bit odd for God to just give someone one chance. I mean, maybe there's some souls that they wouldn't take the first chance, but if you gave them 2 or 3 more tries and they learn lessons along each life, that they would eventually turn towards God. So it just seems a little bit odd that you'd only get one life. I mean, you could learn something in this life and then, maybe have 10 lives. And then, maybe in the 6th or 7th life, you would turn towards God because you keep learning lessons. So it seems strange that you just get one life when you could learn lessons in your different lives and then make the choice to turn towards God. I think, I guess to conclude, the Hare Krishna reincarnation view does allow you to eventually turn towards God for that reason. Every life you're learning lessons, you have a distinct state of consciousness. So even if you rejected God before, because your consciousness is different and you've learned lessons, you might eventually turn towards him in a future life. So that allows the possibility for universal salvation. So I think that's many of the points. I think I'll give Seth a chance to speak now.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah, you addressed all of the points there that I captured from Seth's opening statement. So I'll bring Seth on now, and I'll leave both you guys on and give you the opportunity to interlocute about these various points that have been brought up. So bringing Seth in now to respond to your response to his opening statement.
Hey, I really appreciate that. And sorry again for the opening salvo. I was actually, believe it or not, we even talked about this before. I was trying to avoid that, that habit, I suppose. Yeah, just a couple things. I'd like to, can I bring up your opening thesis? That I completely agree that I think it's self-evident that if you have an infinite number of times, all possibilities become actual. If it's even non-zero probabilities over infinite time will happen eventually. I agree that that's a great point, but I also think it might prove too much, because if I understand your system correctly, that there's a point in the future eschatological state where we're sort of sealed in a perfect communion with God again, correct?
So there's basically 2 different worlds. There's the material world and the spiritual world, or
right.
Yeah. And the material world, it's going through periods of, I guess, creation and destruction. So there's universes being brought into existence, there's universes being brought out of existence, and this is going on eternally. But alongside that, there's a super mundane or spiritual world where souls ultimately go once they turn towards God.
Right. But it's kind of the discussion we had before of like, so after the reincarnation system, there's a salvation where there's not this perennial fall over and over and over again. Is that correct? Am I understanding that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So when souls.
So there's, and I think we sort of came to a conclusion last time that it was based on, you've learned something, your habits have been formed, your virtues before, so you won't fall again. So there's a sort of idea that habits sort of seal off possibilities, like you can't fall again.
Yeah.
And I would agree with that. But I think that also can prove, in the same way that can prove eternal salvation, that can prove eternal damnation. Because is it possible that somebody's virtues can become so corrupted, so evil, that they eventually fall away and are irredeemable? And if that's even possible, over an infinite number of times, it will be actualized. So I think that the thesis that you point out, I think it's really interesting. I think it's true, but I also think it might actually go to prove my point, in the sense that if it is possible that virtues can seal us in heaven, which is something you maintain, I don't see any reason for thinking that it can't do the opposite as well. That people can become so corrupt that they will never choose the good, in the same way that they'll never choose the bad after a certain point. With the mouse cage analogy, let me just clear up. My point wasn't to say libertarian freedom doesn't make sense on your system. I completely agree it does. When the mouse goes through the maze, he's still making choices, right? It's not as if it's just like a line through. He's still making choices. My point was that not that there isn't libertarian freedom, but that it trivializes libertarian freedom. The choices no longer have value on that system, so that the choices they don't really mean anything in the overall. And the whole point of a problem of evil system is that free choice has to have enough value to outweigh all the evil that's committed through it. I'll go ahead. I can quit there if you want to pick up on those, or I can keep going.
Yeah, so there's sort of one important point you left out about the part about infinite thing. So it's an infinite number of distinctive, meaning that each instance is different from another, where each prospect. So that's important because in the spiritual world, there's souls, because there's no sort of mechanisms that reshape the soul psychology throughout life. There's a sort of an eternally present time. Souls in that realm, once they sort of choose one option, they can stick with it. So I call this transtemporal monovolitional agency. Basically, across time, whatever choices you do, you sort of stick with them. But that's in the spiritual world. So when souls are in the spiritual world, if they decide they turn towards God, they sort of stick with that decision and don't have a reason to go back to the material world. Whereas, but in the material world, because someone's psychology is constantly being rewired,
it's discursive. It's temporal. Am I understanding that?
What do you mean by like it's temporal? Like
it's discursive. It's wrestling with ideas. It's constantly in flux, in a state of flux. Is that what you're saying? Or is in the super mundane world, it's atemporal? It's more of a static.
Yeah, basically.
If I could use that word.
In the material world, your desires are basically constantly being changed and they're dynamic. So all it takes is in one life to turn towards God. That's all it takes, and then you're basically in the spiritual world, and you don't have to worry about coming back. The sort of thing about it, you're sort of perpetually damning yourself. That's not the case, because let's say you decide to turn against God and you keep turning. These mechanisms will eventually rewire your psychology, and eventually at one life, you could choose to turn. So only under eternal damnation, where it's sort of like a deterministic thing, would it? I guess it's not deterministic. Like, as long as you have the opportunity to turn towards God, that's all it takes. Like, 3 lives 1,000.
And cue the eschatology.
Sorry, you cut out. You cut out for a second there. I heard 3 lives and 1,000, and then just kind of that. I didn't hear anything around that.
Okay, so yeah, I guess you have multiple lives, and sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. Basically, all it takes is within your lives. All it takes is that you turn towards God once, and you're out of the material world, and you're learning lessons through these lives. So it's never like it's not like you choose God, you choose to go against God, and now your psychology is hardwired. You're always going to choose that. You're always getting your psychology rewired, and you're learning lessons. So there's always the chance that your psychology may shift, and you may choose to turn towards God. And all it takes is, like I said, one time. So,
well, I might have an issue on the idea of time there, but I'll leave that aside. Would you think? Do you? Why then? So basically, what you're saying is you sort of leave the mundane world to the super mundane world. So there's this ascension upward into a more atemporal, super atemporal, however we want to phrase it, I suppose. I'll let you choose. World where it's set because it's no longer going through a discursive activity of back and forth wrestling with ideas. It's sort of sealed in its habit. It's
actually a little bit it's interesting. So there's activities going on, and there's a progression from one moment to another, like different sort of, like we say that God is always having these playful activities with his devotees. So, one day he might be hanging out with his friends, another he might be like going on he might be go water skiing with his friends one day, he might go and play some games another day. There's sort of activities going from one moment to another, but the important thing is time is untensed, so it's eternally present, and that means that there's no deterioration brought about by time. So here, time has a destructive influence. It causes things to eventually fall apart. But
now it's interesting you say it's untensed, because you're still saying there seems to be a before and after, right, in the life of God.
So
I'm curious what you mean by that.
It's eternally present, meaning that there are a sequence of events, but they're not within like tense time, meaning they're sort of in the eternal now. But it's like there's no deteriorating influence of time, basically. So it's sort of always in the now.
Yeah, I can understand that there's no sort of deterioration, like there's no sort of degrading sort of second law of thermodynamics. But if they're still tense, then we're still dealing in an A theory of time. We're still dealing in a tense theory of time, though. Or are you saying something different from the A theory?
I guess there is a sequence of events that sort of, some events are sequentially prior and sequentially after posterior. Other events, posterior. Yeah. So there's I guess the nature of it is sort of beyond like human comprehension on one level, but that's sort of the ideas we get from the scriptures. Like there are sequences of events, some are prior, some are posterior, and but there's no deteriorating influence.
Right, and I don't want to press you too hard on this. I was just really trying to make sure I wasn't strawmanning your argument. But I do think the my ultimate objection does still stand in a sense, because I think that there is still a sequence of events. There is still some sort of activity, like in the supermundane world. There's still sort of an mental activity, spiritual activity going on of thoughts, sequences, and that sort of that sense. But the reason we can't fall away is that sort of possibility is sort of deleted. It's gone because of some sort of inner habitual transformation. Is that correct? Am I?
So the possibility is like there in the sense that you could choose to leave.
Again,
and the souls that have left have chosen to leave. But so they always have like the option, but it's like you never act on. It's kind of like a mom in any given life has the option.
It feels like you're contradicting yourself, though. If there's a possibility over infinite time, it's actualized, because that was your first point, was it not?
The important point thing is that distinct.
Okay, so that's kind of why I was trying to figure out your view of time in the supermundane world, because it still feels like there are distinct moments going on.
I guess the reason it's not distinctive is there's not distinctive moments in the sense that your psychology and your desires and dispositions are sort of static throughout time. So this idea of transtemporal monovolitional agency means, like, let's say I'm presented with the choice to leave God or to stay in the supermundane world. Now, let's say I decide to choose to stay with God. Every time that option arises in my mind, I would choose to stay with God. So I always have the option to leave, but because my psychology is sort of static throughout time, I would always choose to be with God, even though I have the possibility to go away.
Right. Now, let me ask you this. Let's pretend that there are souls in a Christian theology. This is just to make sense, to of the doctrine of hell or some sort of doctrine of separation from God. Let's say there are souls that enter into the same way, but their rejection is the other way around.
Cut off for me.
I'm sorry?
Could you repeat that last part? You got cut off for me.
Yeah, you actually did too. That was weird. Let's say, so you think there's a super mundane world where you say yes to God afterward, and it's continual. You will continually do that, right?
Yeah.
Which is interesting, because how then could you fall the first time? Because there does seem to be the opportunity to change it, which would enter a fall account. So what changes between the first and second? That's point number one. Point number two is it possible that someone could say no and that continually say no? Because if you can continually say yes in that sort of super mundane sense that you're trying to qualify as they're not distinct points, could there also be a non-distinct point of rejection of God? Is that even possible?
Yeah. I guess we kind of touched about this last time. By going in the world, you acquire like a sense of wisdom, and that wisdom helps you decide. You sort of learn through experience that it's better to stay with God, and that experience sort of helps you make that decision to stay with God. So it's that sense of wisdom.
Right. So I'm actually not saying that your view is impossible. What I am saying is that it is possible to reverse this argument and actually justify the existence of hell. And I'm not saying this is one reason or another to prefer a system. I'm just saying that your system, it does make sense to me. Like I said, I actually agree with it, but it's actually the very same reason I think hell is a logical possibility. Does that make sense? I suppose this isn't an objection to your system. It's more of a like, well, your system actually, it's weirdly analogous to mine. I've just sort of reversed the logic.
Yeah, I guess your system presupposes that there's a hell in which souls might choose to have the same psychology and choose to never leave. But that sort of relies on the assumption that there is such a hell in the first place and that there has to be a hell. If there doesn't need to be a place in the first place, then why suppose that?
Right. And I mean, that was kind of the point I was making, as long as it's possible, because you talked about as long as if all possibilities would be actualized over an infinite period of time. Well, for me, a possibility is absolute rejection of God, because in the same way that I need to sort of seal people in heaven, because I also believe that people are sort of sealed in some sense in heaven, that same logic might also apply. To me, it's habit, that you become such a virtuous person. So for instance, a mother might, like I think you gave these, a mother might never choose to kill her child. Let's do something quite gross and terrible. That just seems egregious, right? Even though that freedom isn't taken. In the same way, there might be in a sense where people become so corrupt and so away from that source of goodness that possibility no longer it becomes something that's choosable for them, no longer a product of free choice. So I simply have to allow for that possibility in the system, and through revelation that is revealed that actually is. So I think actually the very system, I guess my overall point is not an objection to your system. It's that that system itself seems to imply the possibility of a hell.
Yeah, I guess so. This is sort of where you get down to God's nature. If God's all loving, you would think that given everything else, he would choose to have all souls join him and be happy with him rather than be in hell. So if there's possible that all souls could be with him, why wouldn't God want to choose that over eternal damnation unless there was some sort of logical impossibility of souls coming to him? But I've argued against the logical possibility of, or I've argued that it is logically possible that there could be universal salvation.
Yes, I think that is the point. I think that actually gets into my other objections, though, because I think when you have that sort of system, that's whenever it becomes a logical impossibility, because it would violate the nature of God, because it trivializes human freedom. So you would actually, the worst. So imagine three systems, like a deterministic system where no one falls. That seems to be within the nature of God, but it doesn't give us any free choice. There's no added good. Human choices aren't adding any good. It's just God manipulating all the chess pieces, essentially. Then you have a sort of one life perspective where your choices actually do matter. God has invested you with the creative capacity to make the universe along with him. And the third system would be the system you're talking about, which is the reincarnation system, where it sort of plays a sort of middle ground between the two. It's not deterministic, but it's determined in that sense. And my point was that by trying to sort of reconcile these two systems, it actually, what you result in doing is actually trivial. You keep freedom. So freedom is still libertarian, which is, I grant you that point, that it still is, but it trivializes the nature of that freedom. And it makes you wonder, none of the choices ultimately matter, none of them actually have any real value in the determination of the system itself, the ultimate determination of the system itself. Why then does God not prefer a deterministic system where everything was just ended up well? And I think that's why I think you have to make sure freedom has some sort of infinite or near infinite value in order to justify rape, torture, genocide, all these things. These are terrible evils. But the free will defense says, but freedom but you can reply to that by saying, well, why freedom? It doesn't seem worth the price to have free will. So you have to be able to say to reply to that objection of why is freedom so valuable? And to me, it is in the fact that you have the capacity to truly create something that is eternal. Like you are part of the creative process of the universe that will last from here for eternity.
Our view, hopefully I'm not going up too much, but in our view, the overall highest good that there can possibly.
You just dropped out, man.
Oh, am I good now? Sorry,
you're good. You're good. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So in the Hare Krishna theology, the very highest good for the soul is to basically attain love of God. That love of God is the highest good. There's, it's absolutely, the greatest thing the soul can experience. It makes the pleasures of this world pale in comparison. So I would say that I guess you have a point. It would sort of trivialize freedom if all souls all eventually come back. But I guess the higher good, I'd say a world where all souls can enjoy that greater good of love of God is greater than a world in which some souls lose out on that, and maybe possibly many souls lose out on that, just to have a little bit more value ascribed to freedom. I think freedom is actually sort of instrumentally good because it allows one to attain the highest good of, and it's that freedom. It's because that freedom, because that love cannot exist without freedom. God has to make it so that, well, not God, actually, because that love requires freedom. It is ultimately greater good to allow souls the opportunity to leave God, but ultimately be able to come back to Him than to force souls to love Him. Because if God forced all souls to stay with Him and be with Him, they'd miss out on that love and they would be worse off.
Yeah, and I still think I could reformulate the argument on that premise, which is the system is still determined that you will love God in the end. So that your freedom to choose to not to love God is still ultimate, in some ultimate sense. It doesn't really matter because the system is still set. So your choice to not love God in any sort of ultimate sense doesn't really matter. And it doesn't seem to justify all the evils to get someone to love God along the way. And also, I might also point out that, there is a sort of tension, but I also would agree this exists in my system, which is it doesn't seem that love does require freedom, because it doesn't seem like God loves us, but He doesn't really have the freedom not to love us. And if you do that, you're predicated the possibility of evil in God. And we also gave the illustration of the mother who would never choose to hurt her child because of the love. So that's a tension, but I also recognize that's a tension on my own system as well. But I'm curious to see what you would think of that, because it doesn't seem, because on a deterministic system, let's say where the mouth just has one path forward, you might still end up in a loving relationship with God. Are you saying that you have to, love has to be something that you can reject?
Oh, sorry, you got cut off. What was that last point? Love has to what?
Love has to be something that you can reject.
I guess the important point about love is that when you choose it of your own accord, and there's nothing like God's not holding a knife to you and say, you better love me. It's something you have to choose of your own accord. And maybe there's two types of deterministic factors that can happen. I don't think it's bad if God arranges a system so that everyone ultimately comes back to Him. I think it's bad if God makes it so that souls are sort of forced against their own volition to love God. I think as long as souls have the ability to freely from their own soul love God without coercion or without anything forcing them to love God, then it's free. It may be the case that there's some mechanisms in place by which all souls ultimately choose to love God. But as long as that love is voluntary in the sense that it's not coercion of any kind, then I think it's still valuable. Okay.
We could keep on this. I'd really like to get to a couple of your other points, if that's okay.
Yeah.
You're all right with me moving? Because I realize I haven't even addressed your grace and justice thing.
Yeah, there's a lot more than what we can cover in a 2-hour video.
Just real quick reply is you said that you do have both. You have both grace and justice. So I think you replied to that. But then you tried to push me and said, why not let everyone obtain salvation? Now the point is not that everyone will obtain salvation, because you yourself agree forcing salvation, which you said a little bit later, that's not gracious. That's not just. That's evil. That would be evil. That would violate their free will. And that's so you kind of answered that question, is why can't that happen? It's because God can't force someone to freely choose something. So as long as salvation is offered freely to all, it doesn't have to be accepted, but as long as it is offered, God is all gracious. It just has to be offered. So that's actually where I differ from some Christians, and I get in trouble, is that I'm not a Calvinist in that sense. And you offer the same thing to for justice. Why to some? I think there's a similar answer. But I want to hone in on the fact that you said Krishna takes one step. You take one step towards Krishna, and Krishna takes 10 steps to you. Am I quoting you correctly?
Yeah, that's what our founder Prabhupada said.
Yeah, and I think that highlights my point. I think I wanted to just hone in just a bit on that, because I think my point is being finitely gracious, right? There's 11 steps, and if Krishna takes 10 of those, it's still a finite amount of grace, because on the Christian system, if there are 11 steps, Christ takes all 11. Because in Christian theology, you can't even choose God until God first provokes you and woos you. We're evil and corrupt in our core. And it is God who goes on this rescue mission when we are completely helpless. There's 0 steps taken by the human. It's 11 steps to us, and then 11 steps back, all with God. And I think that's why I emphasize that grace thing, is because there still has to be a sort of earning of it. And so I agree that God can be very, very, very gracious on the Hare Krishna system. I think that's true. The question though is he infinitely gracious? Is he going all the way, or is he just going most of the way? And I just wanted to hear what your thought on that was.
Yeah, so I guess I would also say that salvation is available to all. Everyone has the opportunity to attain salvation. But like you also sort of point to, God makes the opportunity available, but he can't force us to take it. So it has to be a freely chosen act on our part to accept it. And I think just the fact that we have to accept it is some act of volition on our part. So I don't think it can be a case that God does everything for us. He can do everything except one thing we have to do if, in order for God not to violate our free will, is to at least accept that offer, at least accept God's grace. I think that's maybe the one thing we can sort of do. I think that's the one thing you can't actually avoid either in any model, is you have to at least accept that grace. And that is some act of volition on the soul's part. And someone said, God reciprocates. So the grace is there, but you have to at least accept it. And that does require some act on your part.
Yeah, in a sense. Do you think that's a positive, I'm going to use a Christian term. Do you think it's a positive energy contributed?
Positive energy. What do you mean? Positive?
Yeah, sorry. It's tough. It's tough to. Are you contributing some sort of active measure in your own salvation?
I guess you're allowing God's grace to be accepted by you by accepting the offer and turning towards Him.
Gotcha. Yeah, because you're right. Most Christians theology does believe you have to accept, outside Calvinist, that you have, but it's more of a passive idea. It's more of so the analogy used by Jacob Arminius, just to borrow from him, is the idea of you're a soldier standing guard at a gate, and the gate is open. You see the armies of God marching toward you. If you do nothing, they're going to overtake the city. But the only thing you can do is resist. So that's why it's often phrased as either resistible grace or irresistible grace, because you're not actually adding anything to the act of God. Is that similar?
Well, I guess the not resisting is itself sort of an act. I guess God will. Yeah. You could chant God's name once, and if your will is there to love God, then you can. That's it. You can get salvation. You can be free. The thing is, the one thing God can't do is violate our free will. So His grace goes as far as our will is is able to go, or His grace goes as far as our free will goes, I guess. If we're holding back and we're like, oh, I want to be with God, but at the same time, I really just want to go to Disney World one last time. I won't feel happy if I go back to God without going, seeing Mickey Mouse one last time.
Right.
If we have it if we have it in our desires to resist God in some way, God's grace is not going to override our desire. It ultimately has to come from our own heart to accept Him.
Right. In that case, so it does seem like you're coming very close to my view of grace in this. But then I got to push back on the idea of justice. Then how? Let's say I was just thought experiment. I was an awful human being in my past lives. Did all these terrible things. And karmic justice, let's say, ahead of me is that I will experience all these things as sort of retribution. But let's say I accept God, I turn my life around, blah, 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 all that great stuff. Is how then does that affect my karmic outcomes?
Oh, I'm glad you asked this, actually. So basically, if you do any act of devotion, God overrides all your karma, burns it up. So you chant God's name once, all your karma is gone. What is left, however, is God will personally orchestrate things in your life, depending on your desire, I guess. Like, if you make it what we call a token reaction. So if I killed someone in the last life, my reaction might have been to get killed in this life, but I might just get a light slap on the face. And that's not there because of any sort of hard and fast rules, but because God does this to teach us lessons so we can grow and ultimately open ourselves up more and more to Him.
Right.
So even though it was karma, we may have done so many bad things in the past. You may have been a terrible sinner. You turn towards God earnestly, and all your karma is burned up, as we say.
Yeah, that is interesting. I think the biggest difference then between your system and mine is that it just seems like justice is foregone there in that sense. If I could put it maybe in the most, obviously offensive way possible, it just feels like justice is just foregone. Whereas in the Christian system, it's paid for, but it's paid for by another. Which you can, you might still wage an objection. Well, that, you should still have to pay for it yourself. But at least that there's a debt being paid in that sense. There's justice being done. There's a punishment being enacted for a sin. But it seems like now no longer the karmic is burned up. It's you did all these terrible things the last life, but as long as you say this, it's all gone. It's completely forgiven. So that's the tension I'm trying to drive. Is it feels like the Christian system can reconcile these, but the more you press one, the other one has to suffer when it comes to a lot of other religious systems.
The fact that all your karma gets
sorry, you broke. Can you start over?
Yeah, I guess the fact that all your karma burns up, that's just grace.
Yeah, which is why I'm saying justice though. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess there's always going to be some sort of mixture of them. I guess depends on how much grace, how much justice you want in your grace-justice mixture. I think with our view, both are preserved in the way that is beneficial. So the justice is there so that God is not just arbitrary. He doesn't favor some people over others, and He's fair to everyone. But the grace is there, and that ultimately there's as much grace as can possibly be without overriding free will.
Right. Yeah, and you said there's a mixture, and that's maybe I should have been probably more clear on this. Is that's exactly I think why I'm saying with grace you have a sort of either a 50-50, 70-40, or 70-30. I can't do basic math. Sorry. But on the Christian system, it's always 100. It's a complete reconciliation of absolute grace, absolute mercy, and absolute justice. And that's why I'm kind of saying I feel like the Christian conception of the crucifixion as an absolute forgiveness of sins, the soteriological perspective that Christianity offers, gives us a solution, at least some sort of solution that I feel like the other systems are really wrestling with, because it feels like they have to parse it out. Like you're gracious at this point, but not at this point. You have to be just at this point. You know what I mean?
Well, if it's 100 and 100, that sounds like it's 200%, and I don't know why we can't counter and say, well, it's 150 grace, 50% justice.
Well, yeah, I shouldn't say 100%. It's like overlapping, right? Great, God is completely gracious to everyone, but He's also completely just to everyone. And whereas that contradiction, that paradox, is resolved at the cross in Jesus Christ. That's kind of the point. It's not 200%. I know. I kind of phrased it that way. Again, not being clear. But it's that it's complete on every human being. That's what I mean by the 100%. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like you have the grace in that everyone gets this offer of salvation. Everyone gets that offer.
And the sins of the world are completely paid for.
Yeah.
The justice of God is meted out in the crucifixion of Christ, who takes on our sins.
Yeah. I guess I mean, under God's system, I don't see why someone has to suffer for sins. I think if God is sort of the lawmaker, like I mean, this may be a bad example, but like sort of the president is above the law. Someone.
Yeah. Too politically loaded, man. Come on.
Yeah.
I want to throw a spanner into the mix here. And it's good that you just said that, Ādi
Okay.
Puruṣa, because like I'm kind of like losing my enrollment in God right now, because I'm like, man, it's starting to sound like it sucks to be God, because isn't the whole idea of being God that you can do whatever you want? Like, why do I have to be, if I was God, like hypothetically, why do I have to be gracious or just? Why can't I just do whatever the heck I want to do? Isn't that the whole thing? Like the president is above the law. Why do I have to be gracious or have to be just? Can't I just do anything I want? So all gracious, all merciful, all just, and also all powerful. How do you reconcile those things?
You asking?
Yeah.
Who was he asking you?
Yeah,
Oh, sorry. He broke up
maybe
for a
open
moment for me.
question. Open question, but yeah, I think like Krishna, he doesn't have to hold himself to any law. If he wants to pardon someone, he's free to do that. He doesn't have to adhere to his own laws per se. I mean, he does generally adhere to law and dharma, as we say, righteousness. But if he wants to pardon someone, he has the ability to do that, just the same way as the president has the ability to pardon someone.
Yeah.
I mean, of course,
Go ahead. Sorry, I'm sorry.
I mean, Krishna's much better than the president, but that's another topic.
On Christian theology, that's a doctrine of voluntarism. I'm not sure how much there might be an analogy to Hare Krishna theology, and it's held to by many important theologians like William of Ockham. There's kind of a movement away from that now in theology, that God can just do whatever he wants to, because it seemed to be viewed on a certain view of the will, that where God's omnipotence trumps his goodness, which is kind of an odd thing. It's fairly novel within Christian theology, because for earlier versions of what freedom was and what goodness is that no, there is God's omnipotence. One of God's attributes doesn't trump the other one, especially his all powerfulness. We're not going to treat God as some divine sovereign who could just wield it, whether good for bad. No, God is a good ruler, and his omnipotence and his goodness somehow complement each other. They're not in contradiction to one another. And I could go into that. It's a very long discussion.
Yeah, these types of things are interesting. I would say that necessarily does what's best, but him necessarily doing what's best is sort of a voluntary action at the same time. So the tension between those is resolved.
Right. Yeah. So you would say that the freedom of God, the freedom in the sense of a libertarian freedom, is resolved in the sense of God is ultimately good. Is limited in the sense. So God can't choose to wipe out humanity because he likes to see us suffer. Did we lose him?
Ādi Puruṣa's AWOL, so I'm going to call Noah and the flood. He's already done it according to Christianity. So
okay, am I back now?
He's back.
Well, he didn't do it because he did not do that because he wanted to see humans suffer, and that's why I caveated that. That was an act of justice.
Shoot. I guess. Well.
You might want to just fill Ādi Puruṣa in on what happened while he was away from the stream, because I think he missed what you were responding to there.
Yeah, that would be good too. Yeah, if you could say that again, I sort of lost my train of thought. I was going back in and out.
Oh, basically, I said so. God's goodness tempers this idea of his libertarian free will, so that God couldn't choose to annihilate, start torturing and annihilating the human race, simply for the sake of he likes it, not for any good reason, just because he wants to, just because he likes watching.
What about Sodom and Gomorrah? I mean, that's another one, right? Like nuked it from orbit.
Essentially, yeah. But again, how are Sodom and Gomorrah described? As the most evil town possible.
As offending God's sight.
But
that's his choice. He created that. Like he's the one who decided, you know what? I don't like that, so I'm gonna blow you all to pieces.
Yes. And I would say that most monotheists would think that God has a right to enact justice.
But where does he get the book of laws from? I know I'm jumping in here. I got pulled into this. Like as soon as he dropped out, I was like, Where does
You
he
wanna
get his
take this?
laws? Where do the laws come from if he doesn't make them up himself? He's a despotic tyrant. You know, he's an absolute. There's no authority superior to him, so he has to be the one making this stuff up, right? I mean,
Yeah,
So,
but go ahead. You take this.
so
You
wait,
I've been,
you said so you said God's goodness. So by God's goodness tempers his free will, you mean God has free will, but he always acts in accordance with what's best and what's good?
I say, yeah, and I would actually go further and say that ultimate freedom is found in ultimate goodness. That to be truly free is to be truly good.
I would agree. Like you kind of run into some like that you get some of these philosophers saying, well, if God could do anything, could he like choose to end his existence?
Yeah.
I think there is a sense in which, I mean, I don't want to say like when we say God is omnipotent, we don't mean that he could literally do everything.
Yeah.
We say that he can do everything that's logically possible because things that are logically impossible just can't be done. So I would agree that yes, like God's free will is sort of tempered by its goodness in that he voluntarily chooses all his actions, but they're also in accordance with what's ultimately good.
Mhm.
Where the debate might arise with respect to some of these biblical stories is whether these actions are themselves good or not. But that's probably another topic for another day.
Yeah.
I mean, we could go into that, but that's probably a thing in itself.
Yeah. Can I throw maybe a new topic since we've got like 20 minutes left?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, you can if you have something you want to say, go right ahead. I've been kind of throwing everything out.
I'll see what you have to say, and I'll see if I feel like answering it or.
Yeah, I noticed we hadn't. Well, I have my notes and I'm like checking off things, making sure we cover everything we discussed, and we haven't talked about the memory. And you pointed out that it's not necessary for some act to be learned that it be remembered, and that's 100% true. Am I summarizing that correctly?
Yeah. Like if you get punched in the face, you don't have to remember punching someone in the face to know
Right.
that that's an action that sucks and that you don't want to do it to anyone else.
Right. And I think, and just to sort of restate it, because I actually agree with that. My point wasn't that it has to be, but that in most normal circumstances it would be. To be punished for something you know is a more just system on most occasions. It's not necessarily that it somehow logically has to be, but if we're to find it, it seems to be an odd mystery. And if we're to build a system, on what makes the best sense, the best sociological sense, the least appeal to mystery is usually better. That's usually how we judge. But it just seems to be completely mysterious why virtually no one has any past life memories or understands why they're being punished for what they do. So yeah, I was curious what you thought about that. Is there a Hare Krishna reasoning to this?
Well, I guess let's say that you didn't have multiple lives; you just had one really long, prolonged life. I think you'd run into problems because like every life is sort of like a reset. It gives you a fresh start. You get a chance to, you don't have the baggage that you might have acquired in one life. Like in one life, you get certain habits. It's really hard to undo your habits. Like by the time you're 40 or 50, like you're set in your ways, it's hard to change. So the fact that you get multiple lives is a chance to get a reset and sort of get a fresh start with things. I guess given that it's better to have fresh restarts, or I guess given that these restarts are really important, vitally important for our soteriological development, I would say that the fact that some things we don't remember is like a minor trade-off. Had access to what we did wrong, but get a chance to get a fresh start. And it's not like not remembering what you did doesn't allow you to learn lessons anyway. So you're not really, you might lose some, I can grant that you might lose some benefit, but I think the pros outweigh the cons at that point. Right.
But even then I could press further because it wasn't necessarily habits that I was saying. Yeah, you're right. You get set in your ways, you develop habits, but even if like, say you die and become a new person, you could still remember, like say in the act of getting punched, you could still remember a past life memory where you punched someone and that could make sense of that for you. And then you could learn the just moment, but that none of this seems to be happening. There seems to be no tying of this. It seems, I mean, outside of, even if you come to believe this system, you're still not knowing what you're being punished for and how you could learn from it. It seems to be a much more difficult journey without these memories than it would have been otherwise. So it just seems to be a mysterious thing that memories just nearly writ large, either 100% or nearly 100% writ large, are just forgotten between lives. So I would agree. Yeah, there is that. But the fact that it's it's universal or nearly universal becomes oddly mysterious. Because if we to give you an idea, if we took a criminal, say a person who committed murder, and we have we want to rehabilitate them, get them into society. They're a terrible human being, and we take them to jail. But before we take them into jail, we give them amnesia. We never tell them why they're in jail, why they're suffering, and we punish them for that. No one would say immediately that that's a better system of justice than one where they actually know why they're suffering, why they're being rehabilitated, and that sort of thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess that, and it's a little disanalogous because there's no trade-off to be made by giving him amnesia. Like when you forget, like the fact that we forget is sort of the result of a trade-off, whereas you're sort of whimsically giving someone amnesia at that point. But granted, I guess you could say, like every time you get a reaction for your karma, you might, God could instigate within your memory that you remember something of your past life.
Yeah.
It's a fair point. I think at that point it's sort of, God has his ways, and if you could remember all your past lives, the gig would be up pretty quickly. I think the main thing I can think of
is... That's the point, right? You want the gig to be up.
I guess it would, I would imagine that there's some trade-off to your free will that would happen if you were instigated by that. Like, you have to have the ability to forget God, and you have to have the freedom to be an atheist and think that there's nothing supernatural at all about the world. That's sort of a consequent, if we're going to have free will, there's nothing, free will means you have the freedom to do what you want, and God has to give someone the freedom to be an atheist. And if there was a system where it was very clear that this world is supernaturally structured and there's a divine purpose, and you had to surrender to God, and you wouldn't really have the freedom to abandon God, because you sort of know deep down that this God is there and your life's goal is to turn towards him. But at that point, you're not really free to be an atheist at that point.
Right. I mean, you could be. You could cognitively dissonance that these are false memories, or so that freedom isn't eliminated. But also, I'm not sure that you necessarily need to have freedom to be an atheist, because, like you said, like in order to be freed, in order to love God, to know God is different from loving God. And the whole point is to love God, not just simply to know him. So to know that you're actually part of the system might make you resentful. Like all these are possible. So there's still the possibility of rejecting God. Now, it might be harder, but I think the whole point of the system is to make it impossible not to reject God in the end. So my question is, why is it not harder to reject God? Because you're saying, it would be harder to reject God in the system. But I mean, the system itself is built to where it's impossible ultimately to reject God. So I don't understand why being a little bit harder to reject God would in any way be a detriment. I think it would actually be part of the logic of the system.
Yeah, I guess this is one of those things where it's sort of beyond human comprehension. We just have to trust that God knows what's best, and that a world in which you're not reminded of what you did is more conducive for the freedom or the ability to lose sight of God. Or, maybe there would be some unintended consequences of a system where God reminded us of our memories. Maybe there are some unintended consequences we're not foreseeing, and by doing it this way, God is preventing us from a worse scenario.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I mean, it's always possible. Is there any points? I know, like I said, I've been asking you, is there any points you'd like to bring up?
I'm sort of looking at these comments. These are a little bit interesting. We can either do these later, or we could do these. So to God.
If you want to, I can bring the comments in if you want to address any
I think there's one. Yeah, there's sort of one thing that's very odd on a one life eternal damnation worldview, and that is, take the world's. I think it's close to around 8 billion now. I mean, keep at it.
Can you start over? Sorry.
Oh yeah. Exact number. People keep procreating too fast for me to keep track. There's let's just say there are 8 billion people.
Okay.
Only about 30% of them are. How much is the world's Christian population at this point? 30%. Third.
Yeah.
Okay, let's give it third. So that's 2.7 billion people who are like saved, let's say.
Mhm.
It seems kind of weird that those other 5.3, God, he's all knowing, he's all powerful, and the best system he could come up with ends up leaving 2/3 of people like to hell forever.
Yeah, it's an interesting objection. It's one the church hasn't faced. But the problem with that is it's always trapped within the finite temporal context that we are in. So let's say, the church has always been expanding historically, because you could actually push your objection further, because not all those people who claim to be Christians are anything other than in name only.
Yeah, that's also true.
Yeah, so the more interesting studies to me are the ones that are like committed Christians, are the ones that try to find out if these people are actually going to church, they believe, they pray, they do all these things. And if you look at the historical record, it's been an upward trajectory. Now it's about 1 in 7, so a little over 1 billion. Again, still not the number you're talking about. But what happens in 1,000 years? What happens in 1,000 years? Let's say there's 100 billion people. We've colonized Mars, we've colonized other planets, and the vast majority of those people are Christian. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but my whole point is that, yeah, if we're going to look at it from now, for where the church is at now, we might have a terrible perspective. It's like looking at the top of an iceberg and not seeing the mass underneath. So it's tough to make this objection of, no, most people fall away, without a full scope of human history and knowing where the church is going. And right now, the church has been it has been rapidly increasing. Committed Christians have been rapidly increasing throughout the past 2,000 years. So if we were to project this out for 1,000 years, it's not implausible. I'm not saying it's probable. I'm just saying it's not implausible that it could be something where the majority of humans, the vast majority of humans, are actually Christian at the end of the story, when the story is all told. Now, again, I'm not saying this is true or anything, but my whole point is this objection, it doesn't really carry a lot of weight for me, because it seems like it's always trapped in the context that you're in, and the context might not be good.
Yeah, that's but still, like, let's say it takes 1,000 years. Let's just say, I think, so at the current moment, that would mean like 5.3 billion people damned. However many there were throughout history, I don't know all the numbers, but let's just say, I don't know, conservatively, like 10 billion people go to hell. That's quite a lot of people. You would think God would give them some second chance or something.
So yeah, the question is how many people then is too much to go to hell, right? And any number you give there might be arbitrary, because really this question really reduces down to, why is there hell to begin with? Because if 10 billion is too much, so is 5 billion, so is 1 billion, so is 100,000, so is 1.
I think any number more than zero is
right.
More than it needs to be.
Right, and that's exactly, so really, I think your question of why are there so many people in hell really reduces down to, why is there a hell? And I think my arguments for that are exactly what they are. Is the habit. God wants not only people, he wants a lot of people. He wants to populate the people. But as soon as you have a lot of these people, you also give them the opportunity, the freedom to develop habits where they will reject God, ultimately reject God. And to quote Charles Péguy, the French writer, there's two things that God, not even an almighty God, can overcome, and that is the will and the habit, which is sort of like solidified will, which is God can't change your free choices, otherwise they're not free anymore, and God can't change your habits, who you are, because that's what you've developed with. That would be overriding your free will just after the fact. And so if people can develop a way of rejecting God, and rejecting God as a habit, as a permanent habit, then even an almighty God can't stop that. So that, to me, the freedom entails the possibility of hell.
Yeah, I guess my first objection would be that I've offered a plausible way in which God can allow these souls to come back to him without coercing them. And my second is that it's sort of like the evidential problem from hell. Then, like, there's like the logical problem from evil and the evidential problem from evil. Like, they've sort of acknowledged that the logical problem is done, but there's sort of like the evidential, like, okay, like you may have solved it from a logical perspective, but there's so much suffering. It seems just intuitively, it seems wrong. And it's kind of like that. It's like, why so many people have to go to hell? It just seems like if there was an all-powerful God, he could do things in a somewhat different way.
And I think again, you're weighing it, but if you do that, you might only have to weigh one side, right? If 10 billion people go to hell, and then 100 trillion people, I don't know, I'm just throwing that number out there. That's obviously not correct. 100 trillion people go to heaven, right? And yet the only way you get 100 trillion people in heaven who freely choose God is that 10 billion people in hell. Can God not create that world? You know, because it might be more evil for him to deny those people that eternal access with him than it would be otherwise, if that makes sense. And then the other problem, you did offer a logical system, I think. And to get back to that logical system, do you want to reply to that first before I just go off on that? Because I have a few thoughts on that.
Yeah, the 10 billion. I guess they're kind of interrelated, actually. I say if there is a plausible
it's like
system
looking
in
at one
which-
side of the scale.
Yeah.
And that to me is the point. Is I feel like I've offered a system whereby I accept your system, that it is logically possible that as long as it's a possibility someone can accept, but I deny that that's always going to be a possibility for people, because I think that in the same way your system has a way that they can't reject God again, I'm saying that just by that very mission, it allows for the possibility that people can't ever accept God again. They develop a habit, they develop a virtue, a state of being where they no longer, it's even possible for them to accept God. So I would actually accept the logic of that, but then deny that people are always in a state where they can receive grace.
Sorry, these comments are a little bit.
I'm ignoring them. Sorry.
Yeah,
that's the only way.
What was I going to say?
Oh, you mean my comments?
So So the point about the point about people like sort of habitually becoming I guess being habituated to reject God. I would say that because of the karmic mechanisms and the fact that they have a sort of purpose to them to reform the soul, that it's not really necessary that souls become so habituated they reject God. They can learn lessons in lives, and even if they continue to sin, they'll eventually get a karmic reaction, learn the mistakes of their actions, and become a little bit more sensitive and make a little bit more progress. And the mechanisms are in place that even if you continue to do bad things, you'll eventually learn your lesson. It may take a while, but you'll eventually learn your lesson, and you'll never get to the point where you're so habituated to go against God. You'll sort of reform yourself, or at least, it may take a long time, but at least you'll get there eventually.
Yeah, and here's the thing with enough people, I feel like if it's even possible, this is where I'm trying to say, I use your argument in reverse. If it's even possible that people become habituated to this, over enough time, someone will eventually do that. And the only way you can guarantee that is to somehow game the system to where it's not that. And I'm not sure if that's even possible for an omnipotent God. And I know we talked about Molinism. Perhaps it's not possible that that with enough free will agents that one won't habituate themselves into a state of hell, to be just to lay it out there,
Yeah, I would say that it is possible that God could do that through the type of mechanisms I've been arguing for, through this soul making and reincarnation, and allowing these karmic mechanisms to have a teleological purpose to them. At least it's plausible, and granted that it's plausible, we should, if there's an omnipotent God, then we would expect him to do the thing that's more in line with his nature, and I think that would be the soul-making reincarnation.
I agree, and we may just be at a point where it's plausible that it is, and it's plausible that it isn't possible, and then it's just like, well, unless we're God, we're not going to know.
I guess for me, maybe other people, it's sort of intuitively seems more intuitive that given that it's plausible for God to create a world where universal salvation is possible, he'd do so, and any other option just seems sort of to fly in the face of God. And you could probably argue some sort of opposite, but maybe this is actually a good stopping point.
And I would agree. I feel like a point of agreement. There's, God desires all men to be saved. Twice in Scripture it says that. So I would agree.
Yeah. So that's maybe. I think at this point it might be like beating a dead horse.
We never do that.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. I mean, no. I think this is a good stopping point. Like, I think we both made our cases at the rate that we can make it without sort of continuing on
running it into the ground. Yeah.
Okay. Great. So we can go to the comments section if you like. It's been heating up over the last little while. Yeah, I
have completely ignored them.
No, that's a good idea, because as we discussed, we're going to go to the comments. Okay, so I just want to say, first of all, before we go into that, a couple of things. Like, first of all, I really appreciate the discussion that you've been having and the different points you've been covering. In my own personal journey, I started in Christianity and then ended up having these kinds of discussions, with camp counselors and things at Christian Bible camps, and have not really gone back to revisit this since that time. And that was like about 30 or more years ago. And so now to come back to this and to hear these 2 points, these two different systems so well articulated and put next to each other is very refreshing for me. And then the other thing is I came into this thinking like, I'm pretty like liberal and like, and I'm just like listening to this and going, actually, I think I'm more of a hardcore fundamentalist than either of these two guys. Which is surprising to me. Let's go to the comments, hey? Okay. Now, Ram Emelianov has been prodding to get his comment brought back up. Here it is here. Okay, my question for Seth. Do you think it's justified for people who were born before Jesus and people who never got to know Jesus, for example, people from an obscure place like a jungle, say in the Congo, to be eternally damned because they literally couldn't surrender to Jesus because of their circumstances? Does it make a just God?
Yeah. No, that's a great question, and it's one the Christian theologians differ mightily on. So I've been trying to take a sort of what C.S. Lewis called mere Christianity and try to bring in all perspectives and stuff. Never really brought up purgatory, so we'll throw that out. But this one I'm going to just give my own answer to, which is I take the perspective that you are never condemned for what you do not know. And I take that from John chapter 15. If Jesus said, if I had not done the miracles among them, they would not be condemned. But as such, because I did them, they now stand condemned. So in other words, Jesus is saying, if people don't know things, I can't judge them for that. So where does that leave people in, say, the deep Congo 500 years ago? And there's very little scripture to know what's that there is. There's some things, there's like Acts 17, where it says, in the past, God overlooks such ignorance, but now he commands everyone and everywhere to repent. And then there's another place where Paul is talking about prior to the giving of the law, God overlooked such sins of theirs. So that seems to give some sort of hope. But then there's a place like Romans 1, which is everyone knows God exists. And if you go into idolatry, that's an absolute rejection of God. So before and after Jesus is not really the point. The point is whether or not you have responded to the revelation of God that is given to you. And so for me, that is always individual basis. I leave it up to the grace of God. So are there people who are saved that are outside the church? Very possibly, very likely even. But that does not, the point of the key is to bring the kingdom of God to earth. And that's not any reason for Christians not to go out and proclaim Christ to everyone.
Now, that was just what I was going to say, because I'm jumping in front of Ādi Puruṣa here, because this is the conversation. This is the conversation that I remember having at like 11 o'clock at night with this camp counselor, getting into this exact point. Because where I went with that was, in that case, if you get a free pass, if you don't know about Jesus, and like, if it's like, now we've told you about Jesus, you have to either choose Jesus or burn in hell for eternity. Wouldn't you be better off not telling anyone about Jesus, because then they all get saved automatically?
Yeah, my point is not that they get a free pass. I hope I'm clear that I'm not saying people get a free pass. My point is they have to respond to the revelation of God given them. And the more you know of God, the better off you probably are. I mean, obviously, that just seems like if you go in and like that, I think that's why the places where Christianity is infiltrated pretty well, is because I think that the glory of God revealed through Christ, the beauty of that is just so overwhelming to a lot of people. And I think people are better off in that way. But also, go ahead.
Sorry, I'll let you finish. But that doesn't sort of undermine, people are better off knowing about God, then the point still holds that some people didn't know about God. So it's sort of an injustice on God's part not to have them know about him.
No, my point is that everyone does know about God, but to various levels, right? So, I mean, Romans 1, everyone is aware of God through what has been made and through the moral law within them. And so,
but why not? So, partially, and some people know a little bit more fully when the
you cut out for a sec. What'd you say?
Oh, yeah. I guess everyone knows him to degrees, but if it's possible for people to know about God in full, why deprive people of the opportunity to know God in full rather than just only in degrees or to a lesser degree?
Why deprive? So in other words, so this seems to be a switch to why doesn't God, like, say, send his revelation to everyone? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, like some people don't get the chance to know about Jesus, and if knowing about Jesus is better than not knowing about Jesus, why cause some people to not know about Jesus?
Right. So God has so orchestrated the world that his primary mechanism through which he works is man. I mean, that's why God became incarnate. So if God let's say he sent out 1,000,000 angels, right, to just go tell everyone about Jesus, right?
Yeah.
That would be he would have an internal contradiction within the will of God, which is man is his primary vehicle through which his will is attained. That's why when you see people do miracles, it's not usually God coming down and doing it. It's usually there's some sort of human vehicle through which it's being done, a prophet, that sort of thing. So there's that. But then you could say, well, why does he prefer that over the other? And this is where we talked about middle knowledge. I actually prefer the system whereby in Luke chapter 12. Not only is God more merciful to you if you have not heard, but he's also more harsh to you if you have heard and then reject it. Because in the same way you said the ultimate good in the universe is to love God, the ultimate evil is to reject God. And so bringing that to people in certain circumstances where they will reject God is actually adding evil to the universe. Now, is it possible then that God has so orchestrated the world where when missionaries, when the Christian gospel reaches a place, it will reach only those people that have the willing ears to hear them? Now, if it is even possible, now I'm not saying this is true. Again, but what I am doing is I'm saying this is a system that makes perfect sense, and therefore it doesn't show a contradiction between unevangelized people and the goodness of God. So, does that make sense? It's planning a system of trans-world depravity.
Trans-world depravity takes a note. I love it.
I guess, well, does the commenter have anything to add to that?
I do.
I don't know if this
what I'm hearing you say here, Seth, is that basically everyone who did not hear about Jesus but heard about Krishna and reincarnation actually gets to go to heaven because they've responded to the revelation of God that was made available to them.
Now, I would not say every aspect of Hare Krishna theology is a revelation of God. So I don't want to be misquoted and people going around saying that.
But that is literally what you just said, though. You just said
no, it's not. No,
okay.
What I'm saying is the revelation of God. Now, what you're saying then is, well, Hare Krishna is a revelation of God, therefore all Hare Krishna people. Well, I did not add in that second premise, which is Hare Krishna is a revelation of God. Now, it might be partial. I'm a perennial. I buy into some perennial philosophy whereby there's some aspects of truth in all religions. C.S. Lewis was very much of that opinion. And so what I'm saying is I don't know if someone of the Hare Krishna theology who's never heard of Christ will get into heaven or not. That's not the point, though. The point is that salvation is in Christ, and he is the good news. And there was a second point to missions besides going out and saving people that I stopped to allow you to respond. The whole point of missions is not just get people into the lifeboat and save them. The whole point is to bring the kingdom of God. Because wherever God's kingdom goes, goodness comes with it. So there's a point of actually why missionaries bring food, they bring water, they bring shelter, they bring all these things. It's not just about saving their souls. It's about making the world a better place. Because in Christian theology, there's a high emphasis on the fact that God is redeeming the world. He's not going to destroy it. There is a fire element that we hear about in our eschatological texts, but that's a purifying fire where God is going to redeem the world.
Eschatology.
Eschatology, we did. We're going to redeem the world, right? And that we get to partake in that. And that's why I think our free choices are so significant, is because every good thing we do is actually building the kingdom of God on earth. And so bringing the gospel of Jesus Christ isn't just going out and preaching, although that's a huge part of it. It's giving water to someone in need. It's feeding the poor. It's helping people who are trapped in slavery. That is the kingdom of God, all of it together. And so, yeah, I mean, that to me explains it. So even if salvation isn't even in question, missionaries, the church has a duty to go into all the world, even if salvation wasn't a question. But obviously it is as well.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would add is, so you said that you believe that all religions have some merit of truth to them.
Mm-hmm. Well, not all, but Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Like some
Not branch Davidians.
Flying
Yeah.
spaghetti monster?
Yes, there we go. Even better.
Yeah, it seems like if all religions have some merit, then God would arrange different religions to exist so that people could get some gradual elevation in this life, so that they could prepare themselves for a future life. I think that seems to be one sensible reason why some religions would have some merit of truth. Otherwise, it seems like it's just confusing people into a wrong path. But why allow for these religions to exist in the first place if it's just going to get them partial benefit, but then they ultimately have to go to hell anyway?
Yeah, two reasons, and I think these are explanations at two different levels. One is the fact of human sinfulness, the very fact of free choice, right? The fact that we can be deceived, the fact that we can. So, I mean, let's take something that we both can. I don't know. Take some religion X. I don't want to offend anyone. Take some religion X that has some clearly false beliefs, but some true ones. Say they believe in one God, something that we agree on.
Flying spaghetti monster.
Yeah, there we go. Flying spaghetti monster. I don't think anyone actually believes that, though, unfortunately. That'd be great if somebody did.
That's almost blasphemous to say that.
I know it is. But like this, take some religion X. I think that's in one sense that they can come to some truth, but there's some additions, there's some adding that reveals human sinfulness, human ignorance, and the need for revelation from God. The fact that God is needed to come into the system to help us, which is where my idea of the full grace of God comes in. And number two, I could always just say it's preparatory, right? In the sense that people do have a spiritual aspect. God has built us with what John Calvin calls a sensus divinitatis, a sense of the divine. Yeah. A sense of the divine. And by that, outside of God revealing himself, that might manifest in a million different ways, but you have to have that so that when the gospel comes, you're ready and willing to accept it and see it for the truth that it is. But, but so the only way you would have no religions at all is if you might remove that sense from humanity.
Yeah. Religions are there to sort of...
Sorry, can you start over again? It does it right when you talk every time.
Oh.
Jesus messing with the Wi-Fi connection.
So other religions are there to sort of make the field more fertile for the message of Christ in some places.
Message of Krishna, I think you meant to say. Sorry,
let me clarify. When I said they're preparatory, I meant the sensus divinitatis is preparatory, not the religions themselves.
Okay, maybe
Does that make sense? Sorry.
Yeah, but also another point I think about now is that let's say there's some truth to these religions. It would seem that people by following these religions are making some spiritual advancement. Maybe the only thing is that maybe they fell short. They got 50%, and then they had to go to hell because they couldn't do the other 50%. But if they're making progress, they're on their way. Why say, okay, you didn't make it this far, now you're in hell forever? Why not just give them chances to pick up where they left off?
Well, I'm not saying. Well, you're saying like a reincarnation method?
Like if every religion, not every, okay, if some religions other than Christianity have some merit, and by following it you can make some advancement, then it seems like the people who are following these religions are making some advancement. So why make it so that they have to go to hell? Why not just let them continue to make advancement? Why not hypothetically say they could take another birth in a Christian family and then turn to Christ in that life?
Well, I don't think it's like a 50% or like you make it some way. That nearly sounds like a works-based salvation. So I might push back on that and say it's either you have it or you don't. You either accept the revelation of God given to you or you don't. And that's really what's needed. So it's not as if some people, they just nearly made it and then sorry, you're in hell forever, right? The idea that they're on that trajectory means they have a will that's habitually in a state of acceptance of God. So again, this is all hypothetical persons, and it's difficult to know because it's all hypothetical and abstract. But that would be a person that would be on a trajectory towards God. It's not as if they get 50% of the way there, unexpectedly die, and now they're in hell, because that would be a very works-based idea of salvation rather than a grace-based.
Well, I guess like I sort of indicated earlier, like the works are there to sort of soften your will up. So maybe someone's closed off, but maybe through some other spiritual process, they can open their heart up and open their heart up and open their heart up more to God.
Yeah, and Christians think that happens to us, right? Philippians chapter 1 says, "He who began a good work in you will carry it to completion," right?
But why should it just be only Christians?
Well, that's my
Why
point.
can't other...
It's not necessarily people who necessarily bear the name Christian who do. What you need to get into heaven is not being a Christian. What you need to get into heaven is knowing Christ. However that's manifested to you, however that comes about. But that there's obviously very special limitations. So my point is that the revelation of God is given to all, so that all men now stand before God without being able to say, I didn't know. And you're judged based on your response to that. And I think I said in Luke chapter 12, God, those who did not know are basically said they're given more of a lenient pass based on the fact that they didn't have the full revelation. And that's where I brought in the other fact of, had they known the revelation, would they have rejected it? Is God actually being merciful, knowing these people ahead of time would have rejected his revelation by not giving them the gospel? Now, as long as I'm not saying that's true. I'm saying that as long as that's even possible, there's no contradiction between the problem of the unevangelized and Christianity.
So I'm not quite clear there. The unevangelized, are they saved, or do they burn in hell?
Well, I think that's the whole point I'm saying. I mean, you can't class this as a group, right?
Some of them are saved and some of them burn in hell.
That's like, yeah. Well, that would be like saying, are Americans Republicans, or are they Democrats, or are they independents? You know, it's not a question of whether. It's not a question for me of whether or not you've heard the particular full gospel message, because that would contradict certain scriptures. It is whether or not you've responded to the revelation of God given to you. Romans chapter 1, all men now stand condemned before God if they reject the revelation of God, which he says occurs through nature and through the moral law within.
So it does seem like you're becoming like a religious pluralist in that case, and a Christian exclusivist only in certain specific cases where, you can apply the theology and the doctrine.
Well, I've never called myself a Christian exclusivist. I've always called myself a subscriber to perennial philosophy. The idea that
like
there
an
is
inclusivist or something.
Well, I would call myself a partial inclusivist. For the reason, not necessarily that I think anyone, because it still might be possible that no one is outside the church does accept God. That's perfectly possible. I can't rule that out. So in a sense, I might actually be an exclusivist. What I'm saying is the Christians, based on the scripture given to us, have to maintain that it is not an acceptance of, you have to be presented the gospel in order to get into heaven, because then God couldn't condemn people, like the questioner rightly said, who existed before Jesus, or people
from the Congo.
Yeah, the people in the Congo, which, like I said, Acts chapter 17, God overlooked such ignorance up to that time. What does that mean, other than that he didn't hold those sins against them? Which Paul again says in Romans, whenever he says, God, when he starts talking about the people before the giving of the law, that these sins were not truly sinful. They weren't counted as transgressions. Paul makes a division between sin and transgression, where it's, what they did was wrong, but they didn't know it was wrong. So God didn't really hold that as against them. It was the coming of the law that made sin truly sinful. That's a real tough set of verses to interpret, and you see interpreters dance around it. But it's very clear that Paul is giving these people a pass.
Yeah, so it seems as though in your system there is kind of a tension between Jesus, I am the way, the truth, and the light. No one comes to the Father but through me. And then this idea of the unchurched, the unevangelized, the unsaved. Mm-hmm. Whereas in Ādi Puruṣa's idea of this progressive kind of spiritual evolution over multiple lifetimes, multiple opportunities, it's kind of baked into the system explicitly, and there's no tension in there.
I wouldn't call it a tension, right? Christ says no one comes to the Father except through me. Not through the church, not through the message, but through me. No, and I think I said earlier that salvation is through Christ. It's not through being a Christian. And that's also why I sort of differentiated. You said 2.7 billion people are Christian. I'm like, that doesn't give you a path, just calling yourself a Christian. That's why I kind of pushed when you said that. I was like, I had that sort of reaction, is because I don't. It's through Christ that we're saved. It's not through being a Christian.
Let's go fundamentalist here. I'll get the two of you to give your judgment on this particular commenter, right? Okay. So, Seth, you can go first, and then Ādi Puruṣa, you can give your assessment of the destination of his eternal soul. This is Vishal Maharaj. He says, I reject the biblical version of God. He's obviously heard of the gospel, and he's like explicitly saying, I'm a no to that. And he takes it one step further, and he goes on to reject Paul as well.
All right.
So where is this guy? Where's he headed? Seth, you go first.
You're going to hate me, but I'm going to take the Catholic Church approach. The Catholics never say anyone's in hell. They just say when people are in heaven. I'm going to say I don't know the state of your soul, but I can say that people who reject the revelation of God as has been handed to them is a rejection of God himself. So I have to speak abstractly because for all I know, this guy is just trolling. Maybe he's a Christian. Who knows? I can't make a judgment on his soul based on 2 comments.
Okay.
So.
Yeah. There's only one unforgivable sin that's mentioned in the Bible, as far as I'm aware, and we're not going to mention what it is because you might try it.
So
Ādi
what would I say
Puruṣa,
about
over
him
to
then?
you.
Yeah. I mean,
He
depends.
rejects the biblical version of God, right?
We accept a God, but we reject
Not the biblical,
exclusive. Yeah. So I would say, depending on your vision of God, you could go back to God in this life, few lives if you want to take your time in this world, But if you reject the biblical version of God, there's still hope for you.
There's still hope for you, but what track
Actually,
are you on
I should
right
add.
now? If it happens right now, if the lightning struck.
Yeah. I would add that even if you rejected Krishna, even if you rejected our theology, you could still go back to him eventually through reincarnation, soul making.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's no final. It sounds like there's
Yeah.
no final. There's no final exam to pass for you, Ādi Puruṣa.
No final exam. You have to pass it, but depends sort of. You have to pass it in one life. When you pass it in that life is on your end, but
you get
you
unlimited
have to
retries.
yeah, you get as many tries as you want. It's not like the SAT where you only get like 3 tries. You get as many tries as you need to.
Whereas it sounds like, Seth, your version is like there's an SAT and it's a one shot. Like it's this lifetime, you get one shot at it and you either pass or you fail. And 70% of people fail.
Well, I wouldn't say 70% of people fail. That was a big point. And nor would I say it's like a one shot, because your life is not one decision. Your life is an uncountable number of decisions. At every moment, God being present, God revealing himself to you. So one life or many, you have to deal with that fact. You have a finite number of decisions to make it back to God. Now, you could say you have an infinite number of tries, but my whole point is that perhaps you don't. Perhaps you can become so habituated in evil that you can't.
On this topic of evil, we got a couple of comments here from the peeps in the comments related to evil. Let's have a look. Godwin's law is that as the length of any internet discussion increases, the probability that there'll be a comparison or a mention of Hitler approaches 1. So we actually do.
Are we breaking that?
No, we're not. Here it is here.
Oh.
Godwin's law. If God is sending billions to burn in hell for eternity, doesn't that make him more evil than Hitler? There's that one. And here's another one this is from Daniel T. He's an atheist who tuned in a bit late and was like, what are these guys talking about? Like, is there even a God in the first place? I said, our starting point today is that there is a God. We're looking at the problem of evil from the Christian theological perspective, the Gaudiya Vaishnava, aka Hare Krishna theological perspective. And he was like, oh, this is kind of boring and everything. But at some point, he got into it. And here's his question. He says, but if there's a God, why is there slavery in the first place? Lol.
Lol.
Yeah.
Free will. Oh, you can take it.
Yeah, go ahead. Free will. I don't think we're going to differ much on that. And it's a good thing we didn't talk about the existence of God. That would have been a really boring discussion.
Especially since you both agree on it, yeah.
Yeah, but on the point of slavery, though, it raises the question, like, if someone didn't do anything wrong to deserve slavery, why is he being enslaved sort of unnecessarily? Like, are we to believe that everyone who's a slave did enough transgressions in their life to deserve it?
I'm going to duck out on this point and let you guys duke this one out, because this is, I think, a crucial point here. Why is that person born and put into slavery? Is it because of something that they did themselves, or is it because of something that their parents did? Or is it just capricious God, just like, here, take this? Over to you guys.
Yeah, I gotta answer the worse than Hitler thing first, because to be really critical, and I don't like being mean, but it really feels like that person didn't engage with virtually what I've said this entire discussion, which is God doesn't send people to hell. People habituate themselves into a state of rejection of God. And the only way God could do that is by overriding their free will, and therefore by committing an evil act. And that would make God evil, not people choosing to reject him. So, I mean, I can only say this so many times. So that's that. Slavery, right? So I think this gets to a point that it was one of the points that was we didn't have time for, which is, yeah. So if a person, let's say a child goes into slavery and is beaten, and I'm going to get explicit, gets raped and gets shot and thrown overboard because they did some minor offense or something like that. On a Hare Krishna system, you go, that child deserved every bit of that. To me, that doesn't seem like a just system. I mean, perhaps we could say it, but from a purely logical standpoint, but from a moral intuition standpoint, that doesn't seem like a just system. So I could push back and say that. Now, on the Christian system, the slavery deserve it? Well, no. I mean, when Christ himself came, it says in Philippians 2, he took on the nature of a slave. Do I think Christ deserved being a slave? No. But do I also think I deserve better treatment than Christ? No, because what Christ has done is he's redeemed those perspectives. He didn't just eliminate, he redeemed them. And in that perspective, God meets us more fully and more graciously than ever. So that we're on the other side of it, we could see that these brief and momentary struggles were actually leading us to God in a greater way. So it'd be a very similar answer to you in the karmic system. But I think there's an added advantage. I'm sorry?
Wait, you've explained why Christ sort of takes on a status of that, but why would baby Sally, who's born into a system of slavery, what was the response to that? Why does Sally have to be born a slave?
Well, why was Christ born into, taking on the form of a slave? And the whole
that doesn't really answer the question, though.
No, yeah, exactly. That's where the whole point is that God comes in and redeems that situation, so that God identifies that. So yes, it's the rich person that's declared to be that cursed, whereas the blessed are the poor. That, as Luke tells us, blessed are the poor, because that's who God identifies with. That's where God's grace is fully shown, not necessarily in this life, but in the next. That's where people meet God. That's where people need God. And as you said, they love God the most. Christianity started out as a system for poor. That was like Celsus's original objections to Christianity is it's a poor man's religion. Nietzsche, in his Genealogy of Morals, critiques Christianity for saying it was a way for the poor people to justify their situation. Christianity has always been a religion of the poor because it believes that God meets you in poverty, in ineptitude, in your sin, and in the filth, and in the most terrible things, and offers you infinite grace in that. So you could say, well, her being born into slavery is bad, but perhaps it would have been a whole lot worse if she had been born a rich, pompous person who ends up rejecting God and habituating herself into a state of rejection. So, and that's what I think is revealed in Christ. That's why I point at Christ.
Yeah, but then it seems like you don't really respond to the objection. You just take the objection and put it on the other foot. Then if the poor are the blessed, then why do the rich people have to, suffer for being rich and being deprived of the message of God?
Right, and there might be a necessary system if there's poor, if there's got to be rich, where they're and you could always appeal to sin in those circumstances. I don't really feel much of a need to justify why there are rich in this system, because God still tries and meets them. The problem is that because of human sinfulness, it's much easier to habituate yourself into a sinful situation, which is why God identifies with the poor rather than the rich.
Then why not have everyone just sort of start off at an equal, neutral playing ground?
It's an interesting question, but then also I might push the same question to you as well. Why doesn't everyone start off on a neutral playing ground? Why are some people? Go ahead. Every time.
World.
Can you start over? Sorry.
Neutral playing ground. When they enter this world, they very sort of high state. A good state of being. Everyone gets to choose. Everyone starts off equal.
We missed all of that, Ādi Puruṣa.
Yeah, I was. Had to say.
Yeah, I say everyone does start off equal in our view, because when they come to the material world, they come without karma, and they're able to start off as the sort of highest form of existence you can have in this world. So everyone gets a chance to start off from there. No one is sort of dealt a worse hand than another when they come into this world.
Yeah, that's interesting. Which might not be good because it ignores the individuality of people, does it not? For some person, it might be better for them to come into the world as a rich person, and for some people, it might be better to come as a poor. Some person might be better to come in not knowing God. Some person into a family that is knowing God.
I just want to
sort
throw
of
in
wipe out our individuality.
Verse from the Bible here, where Jesus said that it's more difficult for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven than it is to thread a camel hair through a needle.
Or more, so other translations say for a camel to go through the eye of a needle.
Yeah, apparently it was mistranslated because it was a camel threading a camel hair. That's what I read anyway. But yeah, camel or a camel hair. The point is that Jesus said that it's more difficult for rich people to go to heaven than for poor people. So are they actually given an even chance? And why not?
Yeah, regarding the point about individuality, I think it's the best expression of individuality for you to be able to choose your first birth in this world without being coerced. But under sort of one life model, you don't really get to choose your birth. You're just sort of placed into a situation against your will. You can't really choose. Like, I don't know when the soul is born in Christian theology, admittedly, but if it's born at the time of like conception, then it doesn't really have that's when its existence begins. It doesn't have the ability to really choose.
I missed that very last part. It doesn't have what?
Oh, the ability to choose where it's born.
Every time.
Yeah.
Okay,
I think we got the point there.
It's literally like God is smiting you. Because it's the same spot every time. It's like some intelligent agent. No, yeah, and I don't think that's necessarily. I think what that does is it acknowledges the individuality of people. Because
so why can't you choose why can't you choose your birth rather than?
Well, let me ask you: who do you think would know better about where your birth is? Do you think you or God would? And I know that just sounds like a real pointed question. I don't mean it that way.
Yeah, I mean, obviously God, but the thing is God forcing us into that situation, or do we have any free choice? And if God's forcing it, then we don't have free will. So I think it would make the most sense if we're able to choose the places we're born in to some degree. Otherwise, God's forced.
Well, here's the thing. You get into that in your system too, because God creates you, but he doesn't ask you to create you, right? So the point is, I mean, you push the problem back one step, but it doesn't eliminate the problem, I don't feel like. Because when God creates you, he always creates you in a situation that you do not choose. So he's always overriding your freedom in the very act of creation because you don't exist.
You're sort of brought into the best situation possible for you, but then from that you have the ability to choose your choices. Whereas that you don't really have that so much of a choice in because let's say you're born into a family, it's like, oh, I'm born into this family, I can't change it now. I'm sort of locked in. This is my existence.
Right, and the whole point of Christian theology is that God can meet you in all those circumstances and offer you an infinite thing, so that it might not necessarily be the best situation for you, because again, in a monistic system, it might not be to where everyone can get, because of our own free choices, everyone can get an ideal situation. So it acknowledges the fact that free choices sort of limit the capacity of God to give everyone the best possible situation. But at the same time, it still is not a place where God can't also meet you in that situation and provide an infinite grace and infinite reward through that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess I would just push back and say that under like the Hare Krishna theology, you are able to maintain free will and allow people to have the choice of where their first birth in this world is.
Yeah, but there's a weird situation that you get into there because somebody chose their first birth. So you're talking like maybe thousands of years ago?
As far as the time scales, it could be quite a while before that.
Millions, a long time ago, essentially. Not now.
Yeah, if this universe is just one of many. Maybe there's many millions of universes before this one.
Right, and I must push the logic. And this is a point I made last time, which is if you're born in the best possible circumstance, then the best possible circumstance would be the final state where you can't choose to be away from God, but presumably people do. So it can't be the best possible circumstance that God is putting them in.
Wait, you're saying you can't be born in a state where you can't turn away from God, or?
No, the best possible circumstance for someone to be created, to enter into existence, would be a state where they love God to the point where they cannot reject God.
I guess the starting point of
I think you're pointing out you're trying to point out a problem that I don't think the Hare Krishna system can avoid, because there are still souls. There are still, I hope I'm using the correct terminology. I apologize. Correct the souls that refuse God and enter into the mundane world, right? They still have this false narrative. So there's something about it that was not the best circumstance, because for that decision to be free, there was a chance that they could not have made that choice, because you want to say that choice was free. So the best possible circumstance would have been one where they never made that choice to begin with. So I think there's an equal problem there, that God is not putting people in the best possible circumstances in both the Christian and the Hare Krishna theology.
I guess in our theology, God does put you in a state where you're in the super mundane realm to start off with, and you can choose to be with him. And that's the best state for the soul. And most souls do choose that, to stay in that, and they enjoy love of God. It's just inevitable that you create souls, libertarian free souls, that you can't actualize a world where no souls are free but don't misuse their free will. But he at least arranges that when souls are there, they're in the best possible state. Most of them stay with God, and the ones that leave do so of their own desire, rather than start off in a state of misery and then have to come. Rather, you start off in the best state, and only a few leave, relatively speaking, but then they get a chance to come back.
Right. And so but you've also said that, like, when they come back, there's that sort of seals the deal. So that actual state is actually better than the state they originated in. So it can't be the best possible state if the latter state is better. But now you could say it actually is impossible, because they need that experience to actualize that state. But then if that could make a very similar appeal, which is that God uses the circumstances of the world universally for persons to actualize the best possible state, maybe the most possible soul saved. So I can employ a very similar logic that's being employed by the Hare Krishna system, and say, maybe not everyone has an individually the best possible circumstance, but overall, the best possible circumstance is actualized, maybe the most number of souls saved versus damned, right? Because of the situations in God utilizing free choices of people to actualize states that bring the most people to salvation.
Yeah, I guess at the end of the day, you do get a similar view, but I would sort of argue that being brought into the best state of existence at the get-go is better than sort of being brought into this world in a state of misery necessarily, and then having to work up. Like, it's better if most people are up, some go down, and then those people go up, rather than everyone comes down and then has to go up.
Right. And this gets, and I don't want to venture too much into what we talked about last time, because I don't think that's necessarily a possibility. And that goes into what I talked about before, which is habits have to be formed. So there's no such thing as a habit that's sort of preloaded into it. And in Christian theology, there was a sense in which we were born into a paradisal state, but because Christian theology is highly anti-individualistic, we can make sense of the fact that while I am not born into a state of paradise, nevertheless, I have to suffer for the consequences of other people who've erred. So, but that's, I know we've talked about that a lot in the last debate.
Oh yeah, that was in the last debate.
Yeah, I know. But it comes full circle, I suppose. That's all that in the comment.
Yeah, that's funny. We're at the top of the hour, so we'll wrap up after this point.
So
I guess this point was covered in the last debate. So maybe
if you want to respond to that point, and then we'll wrap up, Ādi Puruṣa.
Well, we responded to it and had a good discussion on in the last video. So in the interest of time, I might just point people towards the first debate we had on the problem of evil, which you can check out on Theology Unleashed, where Western skepticism meets Eastern theology. So
and gets crushed.
So there's a little bit of a plug.
Ouch.
Well, it's part of the hype. It's great. It's been a great conversation, and it really is a perennial conversation. It even appears in the Bible, where the disciples come to Jesus when Jesus heals a man who's blind. And then they say to him afterwards, not like, how did you do that? No, the question they ask is, was this man born blind because of some sin of his own or because of some sin of his parents? And Jesus, of course, avoids the entire thing, as he does, as he loves to do, like when they asked him about paying taxes to Caesar for a higher principle. He's like, details. The higher principle here is that this man was born blind so that the glory of God might be demonstrated here today. And, as a highly fundamentalist theist myself, as I've discovered in this conversation, I have to say that while there's been a difference in the details today, the glory of God has been expounded in this conversation. And I thank both of you for coming to this conversation with your full faith and your full intellectual capability and engaging in this discussion in such a fruitful way. And
yeah, thank you.
Sorry, go ahead, Seth.
Thank you. And I wanted to throw this in as it was actually something I read yesterday by a guy I just referenced, Charles Péguy, a French thinker, who said, when talking about interreligious dialogue, which I thought was super appropriate, what matters is not victory, but the contest itself. God is glorified in that. I thought that was a good way to throw that in at the end.
Yeah, this was good. I think I like it very nasty, but
the demigods of Wi-Fi are not with you today, Ādi Puruṣa.
Oh man,
you need to do a Ganesh puja.
I know some exorcists.
Yeah, I was gonna say that. This was nice. Like, this was very respectful. These types of things could get nasty, but we kept it very civil, and despite our differences, I think we had a good conversation.
Well, I'm normally a very nasty human being, so.
Yeah, it's a consequence of taking up religious practices, right? You become
Awful.
a nasty person. And look, the purpose is not victory, but it would be good to be able to declare a winner on points, and I just can't do that. So I have this idea, right? How about this? We had an atheist drop into the conversation late in the play and was like, oh, well, this is but then got into it, right? And wanted to know why people born into slavery. I was thinking, with Restream, what we can do is we can actually have people call in. Well, we can have people call in. We could do a show called Atheists Object, right? And people call in and they get 60 seconds to make their question or objection. And then you guys get 60 or 120 seconds each to respond to it. We go through everyone who calls in, and at the end, we take a poll. Say, okay, based on this, would you convert to Christianity or would you convert to Hare Krishna? What do you think? Then we can actually call it at the end.
That would be interesting, honestly.
I wouldn't be opposed to it.
Okay, so we can float that idea up and discuss it further later. And if you're in the comments and you're interested in that,
maybe just have people make comments below. That would be interesting.
Yeah, comment on this video, and then we can call them in, so they can have their webcam on, or if they don't, if they haven't put any clothes on today or whatever, they can keep their webcam off and just come on with the audio. Be pretty edgy, live. Yeah, so just to finish, how about we do this? What about if each of you takes 60 seconds or so just to summarize the position of the other person, which is something that we've been doing. What do you think of that?
Oh gosh, forgive me, for I'm going to sin against you. I'll try my best. So, am I starting?
Looks like it. Yeah, go for it.
All right, I'll go right ahead. So, the position taken up by the Hare Krishna today is that there is a logically possible system in which it is possible that all people through a infinite series of distinct, I got to make sure I remember that, distinct moments, that it is possible that that person can accept God. So through an infinite series, if God establishes a system where people have, say, an infinite number of time to do so, eventually all shall be saved. Therefore, any system preferred by an all-good, an omnibenevolent, and all-powerful God will be one in which all people shall be saved, because it is a logically possible system, and an all-powerful, all-good being will actualize the best of all possible systems.
That was pretty good, actually.
Thank you.
Yeah, your position is that free will is a very desirable thing, and the consequence of that free will is that people just, as a consequence of that free will, choose to turn away from God forever. And if that's logically possible, then it's sort of accepted within Christian doctrine as, or at least in your view, as sort of an account of what happens. People just become so sinful that they sustain their own eternal damnation, from what I understand.
Essentially, yeah.
Maybe also something I got from it was that life is a series of choices. That there's one single life that we have. It's a series of choices over which we develop some kind of habituation, which seals our nature, and that the nature and the habituation that we develop in this life determines our eternal destiny, which is either heaven or hell.
Pretty good. That's pretty good.
And Jesus is the only way, the only truth, and the only light.
Since he is all goodness itself. He is what enables habituation.
If you've heard of him.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even if you haven't, so there is no goodness outside of God. And I think that's definitely a point we all agree on. There is no such thing as goodness outside of God.
But I guess my final comment, is if you do reject the biblical God, there is hope for you under the Hare Krishna framework. So don't fear too much, I guess. You should have some healthy fear of God, but there's hope for everyone.
There's still hope for Vishal Maharaj, even if he doesn't turn to Christ in this lifetime, according to Ādi Puruṣa.
Also, I noticed that one of the comments asked if I was an atheist or a Christian. Apparently, my backdrop, I've got to improve on it. I mean, I don't know if you can see there's a cross on one side. There's the Michelangelo. I gotta make it even more Christian.
Is that Summa Theologica there?
That's Summa Theologica. Full Latin and English interlinear.
Awesome. So yeah, maybe like a big crucifix behind you. Jesus descending from the mount.
I gotta improve. Yeah, it's not obvious enough.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for calling in, taking time out of your day to have this conversation today. Thank you to everyone who's been watching live today and who's commented, participated in the discussion. And to anyone who's watching this video on YouTube in the future, the millions of people, millions of unchurched believers, Hare Krishnas, the unsaved, the unwashed, whoever happens to watch this in the future, thank you for giving your time and attention to this subject matter. I love you both dearly, and I acknowledge your commitment and your passion, and that you are both dedicated so much of your time and your energy and your life to this work that you're up to in the world. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Take care, guys.
Hare Krishna.